Picture this. It is December 1943, and we are right in the middle of the claustrophobic, ruined streets of Ortona, Italy. Allied Sherman tanks are rumbling forward, completely blind, about to enter a terrifying, man-made maze of death. The buildings around them have been intentionally collapsed into a sea of almost impassable rubble, and hiding silently in that debris is an enemy unlike any they have ever faced before.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving into a true documentary-style story of tactical evolution. We're going to explore exactly how Germany's elite airborne troops, the Fallschirmjäger, transformed from paratroopers into a brutal ground defense force. And as you'll see, they wielded a revolutionary close-quarters weapon that absolutely changed the face of urban warfare forever.
Let's start with Section 1, the Italian Stalingrad. That's the grim nickname this battle earned due to the savage, close-range nature of the urban combat.
To really put this into perspective, the human cost was just staggering. We're talking about over 2,500 Canadian troops lost trying to take the town. Alongside them, 800 German defenders fell, as well as 1,300 civilians who were tragically unable to escape the city before the fighting began. The sheer density of those casualties points to a remarkably stubborn and lethal defense.
The troops inflicting these heavy casualties belong primarily to the 1st German Parachute Division. Even after the war in 1945, a totally objective assessment by the U.S. War Department recognized them as a uniquely formidable force, calling them carefully selected, well-trained, and equipped crack infantry divisions.
Moving to Section 2, Hunters from the Sky. So, who exactly were these soldiers, and why on earth were paratroopers fighting street by street in Italy?
Well, to understand these troops, we really have to look at how their combat doctrine drastically shifted. Back in 1941, the German airborne suffered devastating casualties during a massive drop on the island of Crete. Because of those staggering losses, their doctrine completely flipped. By 1943 in Italy, they executed 0 combat jumps. Instead, they were completely repurposed as elite, static ground defenders, a role they would perfect and carry right into Normandy in 1944.
But this new role came with a massive operational challenge. Operating as ground infantry holding defensive lines in super rugged terrain, they often lacked heavy divisional armored support of their own. They didn't have massive tank battalions to counter the advancing Allied armor. They were basically light infantry going toe-to-toe with heavy metal.
Which brings us to Section 3, the tank fist. To survive, they had to rely on a cheap, disposable, and terrifyingly effective infantry weapon. This was the Panzerfaust, which literally translates to tank fist. Its evolution is actually a really fascinating story. It started out as the smaller Faust Patron in 1942 and 1943, which had a very limited range. But by 1944, it had been upscaled into the definitive variant for taking on Allied armor, the Panzerfaust 60.
The reason this thing was such a game-changer comes down to its specs. It was incredibly lightweight at just over 6 kilograms, or about 14 pounds. But on the end of that 3-foot tube sat a massive 149mm shaped charge. That oversized warhead was capable of piercing the heavy armor of almost any Allied tank it encountered.
Now you might be wondering, how does a single infantryman fire a 149mm explosive without breaking his shoulder? The secret was its recoilless design. It's basically physics. As the propellant pushed the warhead out the front, the blast exited the open rear of the tube. This balanced the forces perfectly. A soldier could literally just tuck it under his arm and fire it without being knocked off his feet. 0 recoil.
Let's look at Section 4, Close Quarters Ambush Tactics. The true danger wasn't just the weapon itself, but exactly how these paratroopers deployed it in the shattered streets.
The ambush followed a terrifyingly simple and patient process. First, German engineers intentionally collapsed buildings to funnel tanks into narrow pathways. Second, a single paratrooper would hide out in the rubble or a basement window. Third, and this required nerves of absolute steel, they had to wait until the tank was within the weapon's strict 60-meter range. Finally, they would fire the recoilless Panzerfaust from complete concealment.
Imagine being part of an armored convoy rolling into that. It was a deadly, multi-layered trap. While engineers created blind kill zones for the Sherman tanks, paratroopers wielding rapid-firing machine guns like the MG-34 and MG-42 would open fire on the Allied infantry escorts. This pinned the infantry down, stripping the tanks of their protection. Left blind and completely alone, the tanks were sitting ducks for a sudden point-blank Panzerfaust strike.
Moving into Section 5, the Normandy Breakout. This ferocious brand of close-range defense proved so effective that it would eventually be exported to the hedgerows of France in the summer of 1944. Anticipating the massive Allied invasion of France, Hitler concentrated his forces, creating the massive 2nd Parachute Corps. This unit was specifically designed to act as an iron shield in Normandy, relying heavily on the brutal tactical lessons learned back in Italy.
The absolute backbone of this corps was the 3rd Parachute Division, led by General Richard Schimpf. He famously operated under the pretty grim motto, "A paratrooper dies in his foxhole." He commanded a deeply indoctrinated force of young soldiers. In fact, the average age of his men was just 21 years old, but they were fiercely dedicated.
This dedication was put to the ultimate test during the Normandy campaign. They faced crushing Allied air superiority, massive naval bombardment, and endless artillery. Eventually, they found themselves completely trapped alongside the German 7th Army in what became known as the notorious Falaise Pocket. Yet, despite those apocalyptic conditions, Schimpf's division maintained strict military discipline and actually spearheaded the desperate bloody eastward escape out of the encirclement.
This fierce dedication even extended to their unit loyalty. During that frantic, desperate charge out of the Falaise Pocket, General Schimpf was seriously wounded. Rather than leave their commander behind to be captured or killed, his young paratroopers literally carried him with them to escape the trap.
Finally, Section 6, Legacy of the Tank Fist. Ultimately, the German forces failed to stop the Allied advance, but their defensive tactics left a lasting mark on modern warfare.
The impact of the Panzerfaust definitely didn't end in 1945. In fact, the recoilless shaped charge concept was so revolutionary that it was quickly studied and copied by Soviet engineers after the war. The Panzerfaust actually became the direct technical blueprint for the famous Soviet RPG series, weapons that have defined infantry combat for decades since.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to take away from this explainer. The tactics developed in the rubble of Ortona basically laid the groundwork for modern asymmetric warfare. As military conflicts continue to unfold in dense urban environments around the world today, we have to ask, will the terrifying advantage of a single, hidden soldier with a cheap, disposable rocket ever be truly countered by millions of dollars of heavy armor? It is a huge question and one that militaries are still struggling to answer today.